So you've already learned about Flexbox, which is a responsive design, and now you are going to learn about two other layouts that are also responsive designs. And for this week, I actually split them into two different sections, just so that you don't get them confused because they are quite a bit different. So you're going to start by reading through the pages in the book and then go through part one, which covers mobile responsive concepts. So concepts not just with page layout, but for text and graphics and all of that. And then we're also going to cover the CSS Grid view, which is a very popular responsive layout. After you complete that, then you can go through part two, which gets into a second responsive layout called CSS Grid. And the two layouts are different. They are not the same. That's why I split them into two. And CSS Grid is actually a little bit more complicated. So read through the book, go through part one, and this gives you kind of an introduction to responsive design and the concept of a viewport, uh, responsive lengths, relative lengths. So this is referring more to text. These would all be considered responsive text measurements. And then we get into the grid view layout. And so I've got lots of examples. This little structure is pretty much how grid view is set up, and that can simply be copied and pasted into your CSS. And you end up with a little structure like this. And this would be a mobile layout. And layouts should design for mobile first. Okay. And then to incorporate little different layouts, for a tablet and desktop, you end up inserting something called a media query. So you end up with a layout for mobile phones. You end up with a little different one for your tablets and a slightly different one for desktop. Okay, so this covers how to lay out your pages using grid view. Then we get into part two, which is CSS Grid. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can implement CSS Grid. The way that I use CSS Grid is I use the template feature. Okay, but because there's so many different ways of laying out pages with grid, I think that's what makes it more complicated. But you can see by the graphic that the concept here is that you've got columns and rows. And so we go through the CSS for styling all of this. Okay, and so you first learn how to manipulate the layout using the columns and the rows. So that's the first thing that we cover in here. And you can see I've got a ton of examples. And for those of you that are familiar with spreadsheet, you actually may like this whole row and column concept because as you can see in this little graphic, you can merge your columns. You could also merge rows. And that is something that you do quite often in a spreadsheet. So if you're very comfortable with that, you may really like using this row and column feature of CSS Grid. Now, the feature that I like is this one at the bottom. You basically define a page using a grid template. So you basically define different grid areas and you associate those with classes. And then you create a template and you put the areas where you want them to occupy. So if I want a heading all the way across, I set it up like this. And you can see that I want a menu to occupy this little section here. And then I want content here and contact information there. And so it works really nice. And basically, I am using grid areas, even though the grid areas in this example don't match that example. If we look down here, you will see that they do match. So here I've got content and contact, and here's content, here's contact. Okay, and so you can kind of see how they line up. And I like this because it's very visual. You can, even on paper, indicate, how you'd want those little sections laid out on a page, and you just kind of emulate that in a template. And it really doesn't matter how many of these, rows and columns you set up. So I really like this. It works really well. It's a very flexible layout. Uh, and at this point, we actually know of 3 layouts, right, that are responsive. We have Flexbox, we have Grid View, and we have CSS Grid. CSS Grid can also use media queries. It actually lends itself really nicely to media queries. You can see this little example. For my grid areas, I just used letters. And for mobile phone, this is how I set it up. So this is header, navigation, main contact, aside, and footer. Then for tablets, I set it up a little different. And for desktop, I set it up different too. To do printer friendly, it's also pretty easy using the grid view. So this is an example of a printer friendly layout. And so here's some CSS. This is grid view CSS. And you can kind of see how that works. So we have CSS grid, we got grid view, and you are going to be working on an assignment that practices using each one of them. And so you are going to start by converting the vertical Acme page to a responsive site that uses grid view. So you're going to end up copying the folder from lesson 10 to a lesson 11 folder. And then you're going to be modifying the CSS. And then as you look through here, you're going to add responsive CSS to an existing site. I'm giving you the site. This has several different pages, and you are going to be adding that responsive CSS to it. So you're going to be adding the CSS grid. You are going to have to modify some of the pages. And then you're also going to be making it printer friendly. Okay, and the lecture demo does explain how to make your pages printer friendly. You're basically pulling out all the color, pulling out all the graphics, and making everything a width of 100%. You're going to be inserting some attributes for SEO. As you know, SEO is pretty popular. It's search engine optimization. And some of these techniques will help your pages display at the top of a search instead of the bottom. The lecture demo goes into this in much more detail, but you will be adding the meta tags, and you'll be modifying the alt tags in the pages at the Zen site. Then this little section shows you how to use the mobile emulator that is built into Chrome to mimic a phone or a tablet. And then for this last example here, you are going to download a Seuss page, and you're going to be creating, you're going to use CSS Grid to come up with a mobile view. And so this is what the different mobile pages look like, a tablet view and a desktop view. Okay, so there, 3 of them will look different. And so this is the CSS that you need to accomplish that. So that is the assignment. Lab assignment, you're going to be creating your own responsive page. And you can either use Grid View or CSS Grid, does not matter which one. You can see in my 2 pages, they pretty much look the same. And, you know, if we're looking at responsive pages, they pretty much operate the same too. In fact, let's see if I go into the developer panel. Whoops, did not want to go into there. If I go in here and I turn on that little emulator, okay, so you can kind of see what it does. If I display it as a phone or an iPad, or I just turn it off and have desktop view. And this one pretty much does the same thing. Okay, so it's an iPad. Here's my little phone view. Okay, so you can get kind of a feel for what it does. So this is CSS Grid. This is Grid View. You can also simply resize it and kind of see what it's going to look like. Okay, so that is the assignment. Requirements are listed, and you can use this assignment as a basis for your term project. Your term project has all these requirements plus additional requirements. So if you pick something that you really like and you do a great job, it is perfectly okay to modify it for your term project. Okay, so that is the lab assignment. And once you finish that, you're going to go into the discussion forum and you are going to add a topic and you're going to give people a link to your page. So just say my responsive page, whatever you want to title it. You're going to post a link to your page. So you're going to click on it, Control C to copy. And to give it an actual link, if you click on the link button, create the link, that is the link others can click on. And then you're going to answer these questions. Who is the audience? What is the purpose? And how did you decide on the design and layout? Okay, you're going to post that information here and you'll post it to the forum. And then you'll look at your classmates' pages and indicate what you like about their page. And that is the assignment for this week. If you run into problems or have questions, please let me know. Have a great week.